Hello, welcome to the August 2024 monthly online lecture for the Anomaly Archives Anomaly Academy lecture series. I'm your host, Smiles Lewis, and we are the 501c3 nonprofit Anomaly Archives, aka Scientific Anomaly Institute, founded in 2003. We are dedicated to the preservation of UFO, paranormal, anomalous material of all varieties, whether they be the research papers and materials of actual scientists, experiencers, what have you. We cover a wide array of materials, over 7,000 books and thousands of periodicals covering a variety of subjects. And we have recently launched our Patreon community and fundraising effort to support the ongoing efforts of the Anomaly Archives here in Austin, Texas. It is my pleasure today to bring to your attention, if you are not already aware, the fantastic work of Joshua Cutchin. You can find out more about him at his website, joshuacutchin.com. He burst onto the UFO, paranormal, parapsychological scene in 2015 with the phenomenal A Trojan Feast, and continued on with a variety of other amazing deep dives into the panoply of paranormal, fairy, occult, esoteric, ufological, parapsychological, folkloric literature with the Brimstone Deceit, Thieves in the Night in 2018, a contribution to the UFOs Reframing the Debate anthology in 2017. He's a co-author of Where the Footprints End, volumes 1 and 2 from 2020, and several other books that he's contributed to. And his real magnum opus came out in 2022, The Ecology of Souls, volumes 1, 2, and 3, if you count the massive third volume, which is the appendices and endnotes. And I highly encourage you to read his work and listen to what he has to say. He's done the heavy lifting in researching these topics, and always has an interesting perspective in this, I think, bringing new insights into the subject of the paranormal. Would you please welcome to the stage Joshua Cutchin. Josh, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I guess I burst onto the stage like the Kool-Aid man.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I've talked about this with Greg numerous times, and like a big part of it was just, not even like, oh, I want to write books and leave a legacy. It was just like, me yelling at my car stereo on my commute, being like, I want to have a conversation with you about this. So yeah, just the opportunity the community is what always draws me into it. And anytime I have a chance to help out with stuff like what you're doing, consider me there. So,
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to get to know you through your research, and those rare occasions when I get to interact with you outside the realm of uh, this kind of interface, getting to hanging with you. Oh gosh, I didn't even get to hang with you in 2016, but I got to meet you in 2016, and just as you were arriving, practical, or rather, as I was leaving. But anyway,
I think you were in my car in New Orleans, right?
I
I think you rode over.
we were in vehicles together in New Orleans. I remember that. Yeah, that was an amazing, fun time, and getting to see you perform on a paddle boat on the river. That was amazing.
That was fun.
Yeah. Well, you have a lot of ground to cover, and want to give you as much time as it takes, and really looking forward to this presentation. It is really an amazing wealth of work that you've put into this, and I can't encourage people enough to check out your material. And I would say, folks, you can, as you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We won't be monitoring that till the end, but we will try to do as much Q&A at the end as possible. And we're looking forward to hearing what Josh has to say. So I'll let you take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. How did this project start? In 2020, I had my life turned upside down, like a lot of us did. On top of the pandemic, I had a bunch of personal issues come to a head, and just sort of reimagining my life. Part of that process was tackling something that I had in my head for a long time, which were two main questions. Anne Strieber had made an observation, if you want to go to the next slide, while collecting reader correspondence during Whitley's release of Communion. And she had written on a piece of notebook paper, this has something to do with what we call death. I love how oblique that statement is. But I'd always had that in the back of my mind. Like, what does death have to do with the UFO phenomenon? And the other thing that always really stuck with me was dead people, for lack of a better term, both known and unknown to experiences, show up in alien abductions during periods of UFO contact. And why does mainstream ufology ignore these stories for the most part? So that got me thinking, what do UFOs have to do with the dead? Claiming this, that UFOs are intrinsically linked to the dead, is a weird idea. It requires a lot of supporting evidence. So I wrote what was going to be one book. Next slide. And then I realized that it was, about a third the length of the Bible. So I ended up splitting it in two. So no problem fitting it all in here today. Now, what I want to do is sort of make a case today for this as a possibility, one among many always, presenting it to you with an open hand rather than a closed hand. I had no idea how massive this topic was going to be. And in order to tackle it properly, I basically had to write an entire book of background, which was volume 1. Covering things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, ancient concepts of the soul, monuments like forts, tumuli, and stone circles, ley lines. Like, it just kept on growing and growing. And only then was I able actually to write the book that I wanted to write, the UFO book, which became volume 2. I say all that to emphasize just how much has to be left out of this presentation, but I want to sort of tee us up with a few basic points. So the next slide. You could make an argument that gray aliens look and behave like the human dead and ghosts in a lot of stories. You've got basically the human configuration. Next slide. You've got cold gray skin, which suggests lividity. There we go. Yep. Next slide, skeletal forms, including a lack of genitalia. These overlong limbs and necks that you see have a precedent in Eastern ghost folklore. And now for the most contentious things that separate us from aliens, right? Next one's the eyes. That's what I hear most often. Oh, the eyes are bigger. They seem larger, but if you compare the gray alien face to a human skull, our eye sockets are about 3 times larger than our actual eyes to accommodate all the muscle and viscera and fat that goes in there. So our eye sockets are larger and, interestingly enough, slightly variable by latitude, which might have something to do with the extreme presence of fairy folklore in the northern hemisphere. I don't know. But, the gray eyes do resemble empty eye sockets. And then the heads, that's the other thing. No, the heads are bigger, so they can't be humans. But I have heard from some researchers, including New Zealand researcher Harvey Cook, that alien abductees have their first hints that they have had an experience because they can't get this image of skulls out of their head. And moreover, while alien heads do seem larger than human skulls, cranial deformation is a practice worldwide. And if, as in so many hauntings, ghosts retain mortal wounds when they manifest, why wouldn't our ancestors retain their body modifications? So I think that might be another way of looking at it. Some cultures, for example, like the Yoruba of Africa, depict their ancestors with larger heads because the heads were considered the seat of their character. If you look to the cultures around the Congolese rainforest, they have these Nikiteki sculptures, and they all depict the ancestors as large-headed as well. And the same can be said for the Kwakiutl of British Columbia, where the head rings that they wear are oversized if they were worn by ancestors. So all this comes together to hopefully prove a point. How would you draw a gray alien skeleton and make it look like it's dead? I mean, they're already so skeletal to begin with. And I guess we can trust seasoned ufologists to do better than that. Next slide. Or maybe not. As you might recognize this from the Roswell slide, a human body, the body of a child, the body of an indigenous child, was mistaken for a gray alien, and many waves were made in the ufological community. This just goes to show you that we already kind of have this connection of the UFO occupants and the dead in our heads. Next slide. But they also exhibit a lot of the same behavior that we see in ghost stories. This list here, for example, that I'm not going to read for you, but you get the idea. They seemed in no need of things like eating, drinking, defecating. Even reproduction is outsourced. And these are all things that you would associate with the dead in certain cultures. Even non-greys take the form of earthly animals, and some of these earthly animals have associations with the dead as well. For example, in Africa, mantids are considered a sort of intercessory animal between us and the spirit world. Next slide. And one of my favorite commentators on the subject, Martin Kottmeyer, said everything about the Greys implies the realm of the dead. They skirt virtually every characteristic of life beyond movement. In their need to revitalize their decrepit constitutions and monochrome lifestyles by stealing the essences of humankind, they are fundamentally no different than the undead of literature and film like vampires. Appropriately, we are told they come from a dying world. Next slide. Then you add on top of this that so many of these contact modalities resemble one another to a startling degree. I could make the case that any of these on this slide, I won't say look the same, but they definitely seem to be variations on a theme. For example, shamanic initiations, sometimes the point was to bring you to or beyond the point of death, then come back with knowledge of that other space. So shamanic initiations and NDEs are kind of hard to pull apart. Gregory Shushan, one of the leading scholars on indigenous and ancient NDEs, says that we just don't have a lot of NDE stories, near-death experience stories from Oceania, probably because they tended to view their NDEs through strictly a shamanic context. So it's really strong there. Then you have people like Eddie Bullard, one of ufology's great heroes, talking about shamanic initiations resembling alien abductions, and Kenneth Ring in the 90s talking about UFO and NDE similarities. You've got the tunnel experience, alien planets resemble the afterlife. Sometimes there are dead loved ones present, as I mentioned, and people come back with psi abilities. Here's the thing. I just don't know if anybody is really... The goal of Ecology of Souls was to put these different things in dialogue with one another, right? You had people making this connection and this connection, but I don't think a lot of people were trying to make a transitive power and bring it together holistically. Next slide. I can't list them all. There are way too many to list. But I have found time after time, anything that I see in fairy literature, there's going to be a reflection in modern UFO experience and vice versa. This has become something of a loose rule that I have, to the extent that I sometimes call them phalians. What were fairies? Our current ideas are, predominantly theosophical reworkings of Paracelsian nature elementals. There is another alternative interpretation, though, that certain individuals, this is talked about by Claude Lecoteau from the Sorbonne, would be buried at certain locations and their memory would be forgotten. These would be people like shamans or ancient warriors or revered royalty, things like that. They're buried at a location. They are revered for a time. Their memory as a living human being is forgotten, and they sort of evolve into a genius loci or a spirit of the land. We see this often in animist cultures. I believe it's Buryat shamans are actually literally interred and then dug back up and put into a new place to become the spirit of that place. So you already see sort of the dead and this idea of elemental nature spirits kind of becoming a blurry, porous boundary right off the bat. Next slide. But if we look even specifically at the European tradition, Simon Young, who runs the Beachcombing's Bizarre History blog, said that traditional fairy-believing communities in the 19th century tended, if they thought about the meaning of fairies at all, to associate them with the dead. And it is even possible that fairies were originally born from an attempt to make sense of death. So, next slide. If the dead resemble or to a degree synonymous with fairies, and fairies are synonymous with aliens, as Dr. Valet pointed out in his groundbreaking work, 1969's Passport to Magonia, then by the transitive property, this becomes a lot less foreign of an idea. The dead might be aliens. A lot of other avenues that we have to explore, but this is the kind of dissection of some of our cherished golden calves that I think we need to start taking seriously. Next slide. A concept that'll pop up later in this talk, but also is all over Ecology of Souls, is the idea of the psychopomp. Even if you don't know the word, it's definitely a word that you've heard and a concept that you're familiar with. These are figures who are tasked with leading human souls to the other side. There are dozens, if not hundreds, culture specific. You can think of the Norse Valkyries. Odin sometimes fulfilled that capacity. In Egypt, you had Anubis. In Greece, you had Hermes. The famous Greco-Roman ferryman Charon. Charon, not Karen like Karen. In Australian Aboriginal practice among some tribes, there was Barnum Deer, the North Star that led people to the realm of the dead. In Japan, Jizo, Abrahamic angels, Christian Jesus, also folk figures like the Breton Ankou, and probably most famously the Grim Reaper. These are all examples of psychopomps. But you also have, next slide, natural phenomena. And this would include the sun, the moon, the aurora borealis. The sun and the moon identified flying objects that were once tasked with carrying human souls across the sky to the other world. I think I mentioned this later, but I'll save that for later, an observation. But also animals were often psychopomps, and there's more of a universal quality to these. You can't really say that anything is universal, but these get pretty darn close. Mircea Eliade called them psychopomp animals par excellence. Dogs and horses. Also birds, though. Birds, especially owls, which brings to mind the work of Mike Clellan. The idea embodied in all three of these different animals, and yeah, deer too, they're up there. But birds, dogs, and horses, they are psychopomp animals. They are shamanic animals because they embody themes that you would need to travel to these places. So dogs are companions. Dogs, we think of dogs as pets, but dogs served an important part of community life to our ancestors, doing all sorts of things, but also companions, guiding and leading you and warning you and protecting you. Horses travel to places that we can't go. Civilizations are carried on the backs of horses, or at least they were at one point. And then birds obviously can go places that we can't go and have this sort of cyclicality to their migration that is evocative of the cycle of birth and death that is the seasons, right? These psychopomp themes that you might see among psychopomps, I guess, also appear in UFO occupants in those reports. Like psychopomps, aliens are liminal, threshold, trickster figures, right? The idea of a psychopomp being a liminal figure is pretty obvious. It guides you across the threshold. Both UFO occupants and psychopomps lead us into other realms. They carry wands, almost all of them. If you start to look at Karen's oar that he uses to go across the river Styx, or the key of Epona, a Gaulish psychopomp, she carries a gigantic key. Jizo has a staff. Hermes has a Kirikayon, the caduceus, uses to influence sleep. You also have, even the Grim Reaper's scythe, you could think of as sort of being a variation on that wand theme. That's the most common accessory seen in a lot of UFO interactions. Both psychopomps and UFO occupants have an interest in human souls. They have power over life and death. They exhibit therianthropy, mixing of animal and human qualities. And actual psychopomps do appear in UFO contact. I have a whole list of people identifying these folk and religious figures that are psychopomps during their UFO contact. We've obviously already talked about the owl connection, but aliens also appear in near-death experiences and sometimes around the dying. We'll get to that in a moment. I did read something on Twitter relatively recently that was like, oh, if NDEs and alien abductions are related, then why don't we see grays in near-death experiences? Well, number one, you do. You just have to look for them. But number two, we tend to overemphasize, especially in like America, all the UFO occupants have to be grays. But if you look at some of the data, a shocking amount of UFO reports feature basically human beings or beings of light. And both of those are, in almost every near-death experience. So once you sort of take yourself out of the tropes and look at the data, it starts to form a more cohesive picture. Are aliens the human dead? Are they non-human psychopomps leading the dead? I don't know. But I'm convinced at this point that there is an undeniable death connection here. I say all this to give you an idea of why we're even entertaining the connection between death and UFOs today. For our purposes, we're not looking at the broader phenomena, but the craft specifically. That's what I want to really zero in on. Some of these ideas get a little bit complicated, so bear with me. First thing, let's go to the next slide. How do the UFOs themselves, the flying saucers, the craft, echo the theme of death? Well, Swiss psychiatrist Dr. Carl Jung had a deep interest in UFOs, and in 1958 he penned his essay Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies. Any reading that he thought UFOs were ET is highly selective. There have been some people that I admire who are like, no, Jung didn't think that. Jung definitely was an ETHer. It's like, I don't know. Like, have you read your red book? But in that essay, Jung says, among other things, if these things are real, and by all human standards it hardly seems possible to doubt this any longer, then we are left with only two hypotheses. That of their weightlessness on the one hand, and of their psychic nature on the other. This is a question I, for one, cannot decide. Where should such a thing come from? If weightlessness is a hard proposition to swallow, then the notion of a materialized psychism opens a bottomless void underneath our feet. As you can see in that first paragraph, this is the other thing that I hear a lot of times. Well, thoughts and archetypes don't leave radar returns. Well, Jung sort of addressed that as well. Jung noted two prominent cigar shapes, very appropriately enough for someone writing in the 50s, the flying saucer itself. And did I say cigar shape? Jung noted two common UFO shapes, appropriately enough to the 1950s, the flying saucer and the cigar-shaped craft. Cigars, more on that in a moment, but the circles, including spheres, which sort of view as a circle, they look like a circle if you see a glowing sphere in the sky, was something that he took interest in, that shape. Before we go on, note that the circle or the wheel is a potent reincarnation symbol. You think of the idea of the Buddhist concept of samsara, the Hindu cycles of endless birth and death, and reincarnation crops up in a ton of UFO stories, as do past lives and rebirth memories. I'm not going to go into those right now. Next slide. For Jung, this circular shape was an expression of the concept of totality. Again, to quote him, if we apply analysis to the round object, whether it be a disc or sphere, we at once get an analogy with the symbol of totality well known to all students of depth psychology, namely the mandala. This is not by any means a new invention, for it can be found in all epochs and in all places, always with the same meaning, and it reappears time and again, independently of tradition, in modern individuals or the protective or epitropaic circle, whether in the form of a prehistoric sunwheel or the magic circle or the alchemical microcosm or a modern symbol of order which organizes and embraces the psychic totality. In other words, it's an archetype, this idea of the mandala circle being a symbol of totality, that is an archetype. But what exactly is totality? Next slide. It's connected to ideas of wholeness, the union of opposites, the philosopher's stone, the coincidentia positorum. Jung flirted with ideas that edged really close to these ancient ideas of polypsychism. Normally, when we think about, I think I learned about this actually on an older Anomaly Archives talk that was given while I was writing this book. But we think of ourselves as being, oh, I'm a human and I have a soul, and that's about as far as it goes in Western tradition, which is an outgrowth of that Judeo-Christian tradition, or Abrahamic tradition, I guess. But there were a lot of ancient cultures that thought that we had multiple souls within ourselves. The Egyptians posited up to 9 different souls, depending on which part of their history you're looking at, including the winged Ba and the Ka, which was a dwarf. The Norse sometimes talked about multiple souls, including familial followers, guardian angels, or something like we would call that, one's feminine or masculine aspect, the mind, etc. But this idea of this union of different parts of ourselves is also seen in the Taoist yin-yang, Native American free versus vital souls, and honestly, even in some early Judaism and Kabbalah. Today, we kind of think about, oh, I've got, my head wants to do one thing, but my heart wants to do another. I think maybe if we embrace this concept of polypsychism, of having multiple selves within ourselves, we might be able to understand our human experience a little bit more. But an important quality to remember with this is that in virtually all these belief systems, these souls could wander at will, especially during altered states of consciousness, meditation, trance, sleep, or when on the verge of death. Basically, any altered states of consciousness, things that we would recognize as astral travel nowadays. That's what we're talking about here. This idea of the wandering soul is closely tied to dissociative states, which I think has something to do with these encounter-prone personalities. I, too, have found that I dissociate from my soul, and it kind of wanders away from my body whenever my twin 5-year-olds are screaming at me. But to Jung, UFOs might indicate, whether in dreams or in waking life, an expression of the entire self, unified. That's what totality means. The UFO is a symbol of the self. And then next slide. He wrote, hence, there would be nothing against the naive interpretation of UFOs as souls. This idea, perhaps independently, spread through ufology itself. Arthur Constance, in the November 1957 issue of Flying Saucer Review, wrote, it may be that the shape of the human spirit, if it has any shape, is that which we have come to associate with the UFOs. And Ray Palmer, No, not everybody's probably a fan with the way that he mixed fact and fiction, but he said to Kenneth Arnold in a 1977 conversation, 2 months before his death, I think that the flying saucers are spirits of the dead. Next slide. So what does this mean if UFOs are exteriorized souls? I see three primary options. The first is that UFOs are the souls of the dead. We'll explore each of these. Option number two is that UFOs are the souls of the witnesses, in other words, the living, who's looking at the UFO, accidentally separated. And number three would be the idea that UFOs are souls of a third party deliberately separated. Again, if UFOs are souls, then these are the three most likely scenarios that I see. So with the next slide, let's go to option number one. Souls are universally, this is something you can say is universal. Souls are universally conceptualized as balls or orbs of light. We find it in hauntings. We find it in near-death experiences. We find it in meditation practice and basically early church doctrine too, where ghost lights were souls roaming the earth. If you look through a book of near-death experiences, you're probably going to find someone who says, I felt like I turned into a little ball of light. You know? And there's also third-party verification. People have seen... there's light phenomena at the time of death, but also light phenomena emanating from people's chests or heads or whatever as balls of light during altered states of consciousness and psychedelic use. In ghost investigation, souls are dust particles or insects, I guess. No, I mean, I don't mean to be too hard for the orb community, but I would say not all light orbs are dust or bugs. Some photos are compelling, and there is some compelling firsthand testimony as well. But don't take every photo of an orb at face value. If we sort of explore some of these other expressions, we've got these near-death experiences where people talk about turning into a little sphere or a ball of energy or an energy pattern. I mentioned the early church, Caesarius of Arles in the 5th and 6th century, cited a vision of the soul as spherical in nature, like the globe of the moon. And the abbot of Moramund in the 10th century perceived his true self as a, quote, glassy spherical vessel with eyes before and behind, all knowing and seeing everything at once. All eyes in the front, eyes in the back. A lot of near-death experiencers describe leaving the body and having 360-degree vision. In indigenous and ancient thought, Native American tribes like the Cherokee have reported luminous balls since antiquity, and often regard these as the wives and mothers of warriors looking for their loved ones after death. I don't know if that's romanticized or if that's actually what they thought, but there are indications to that. In Vedic cosmology, the soul is a microcosm of the sun. In China, the first poetic anthology, the Shi Jing, attributes souls a very bright and very glorious appearance. And in Japan, the Hitodama, human balls or souls, appear as misty pale blue or green orbs with spiraling tails. So that's a very consistent idea. And so many of these UFO sightings are just lights in the sky. Option number two. Next slide. UFOs are the souls of the witness. In other words, the living, the person seeing them that is accidentally separated. Remember, we talked about having multiple souls. So the idea that you could see your soul outside of your body isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. Either as a visionary object, a physical manifestation, or something in between. There are a lot of differences. There are a lot of definitions of the imaginal versus the imaginary. The one that I've sort of come up with myself is imaginal is from your head, but not in your head. And that might be a way to think of this sort of realm that we're talking about here. Obviously, this does tie into the possibility of co-creation theory. Are we generating these things? Do we have an inability to see the true self of the other? Or does the other appropriate our expectations? I don't know, but that's one place to start. Next slide. From Terrence McKenna, and yeah, I'll do the voice.
This is an important point to make, which the flying saucer people are forever misunderstanding. Saying that the flying saucer is a psychic object does not mean it's not a physical object. Jung in Mysterium Conjunctionis is at great pains to say that the realm of the psychic and the realm of the physical meet in a strange kind of never land that we have yet to create the intellectual tool to explore.
I put that there because people will hear me talking about ghosts and souls and the imaginal realm and be like, well, those things don't leave burn marks in the ground. Well, a lot of what I'm working on right now actually points to the other direction. We tend to separate inner and outer
spirit and physical, we've erected a barrier between those things, and I'm not sure how much of a barrier there should be. For example, one of the earliest techniques for ghost hunting would be to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to manifest. Ghosts are non-physical, and they're leaving footprints. They're slamming doors. So, psi phenomenon points to this as well, like something in your head is interacting with the outside world. So I think that's sort of a false dichotomy that we're dealing with. But returning to the matter at hand, are UFOs the souls of witnesses? It's a weird idea, but it speaks to the idea that of polypsychism, right? Multipartite souls, an aspect of ourselves, can wander during altered states of consciousness. We see wandering souls in NDEs, in OBEs, and psychedelic trips. This is called autoscopy, which is the point of view of seeing yourself. Interestingly, a lot of UFO witnesses report being in a sort of trance. The assumption is that the craft is somehow generating that, but what if the trance is generating the craft, and it's part of this wandering soul concept, since souls can wander during moments of trance? Seeing yourself, seeing your soul, autoscopy, POV of the soul, most common, or POV of the body, which is where the notion of the double comes from. Next slide. If UFOs are an exteriorized aspect of the witness, in other words, the living self, then they are functionally identical to our doubles, which you might know as doppelgangers. Doppelganger is German for double goer. It was popularized by Catherine Crowe's 1848 The Night Side of Nature. But there are different versions seen across other cultures. In Scotland, it was the Wraith. In Ireland, it was the Fetch. But you see doubles across a lot of different cultures, indigenous cultures as well. It's found virtually in every culture that embraces polypsychism. There is a widespread idea that seeing someone's double signified their impending death. And this is where it sort of gets a little bit granular. This idea of seeing the doppelganger means you're about to die. It's a symptom. It's not a cause. The idea is that an aspect of your soul has departed your body, which is leaving your physical self weak and vulnerable and susceptible to death. This is one of the reasons that in a lot of cultures you weren't supposed to wake someone from being asleep, because the body was in one place that you were waking up while the soul was out wandering about. If you woke them up, you might kill them because their soul had left the body. So in other words, it's a side effect to being near death rather than a cause of death in and of itself. And it's something that you see in a lot of different places. Next slide. But death omens in general. So the doppelganger is a death omen. The UFO, of the anomalous light variety, might be the exteriorized soul of the witness. And death omens also appear as anomalous lights. So see, we're getting some consistency here, right? Doppelgangers, aspect of the self, death omen. UFO, perhaps aspect of the self is a ball of light. Ball of light, death omen. It's all starting to make some sense here, I think. These anomalous lights, known as orbs, ghost lights, or fairy lights, are perhaps the most common unifying paranormal phenomena. You'll find it in literally if you're interested in the paranormal, no matter what your little domain is, you will find anomalous light phenomena. It's just a fact. In Wales, corpse candles, they were called, were lights that would bobble on pathways preceding death of someone in the community. They would travel the route from the house of the doomed to where the corpse would be buried, predicting the path of the funeral procession. Similar beliefs are recorded among indigenous American tribes, like I believe the Inuit, appearing above the huts of those about to die. This might explain that universal prohibition that you hear, don't follow the lights, don't follow the will of the wisp. You might encounter yourself, which is a death omen. In other words, the double, as either a vision of yourself or an anomalous light, is a sign of impending death. So do we have examples of UFOs preceding death? Next slide. As luck would have it, UFOs, both in the form of anomalous lights and structured craft, sometimes appear before death. There is an immense and storied universal tradition of aerial phenomena like meteors and comets, signifying impending change, including regime change, war, plagues, famines, deaths, especially of emperors and religious figures. This idea seems to have carried over into ufology in some circles. The idea of this, death omen might actually explain some cases that I've collected. These are just a few among many. Great John Keel quote here. He said, in the 1960s, we had a great many sightings directly over funeral homes and mental hospitals. Earmarked in the 1979 lecture. I could never figure that out. Off to the right below Keel, you'll see Mona Stafford and Elaine Thomas. 2 years after their shared UFO sighting in missing time, Mona learned about Elaine's fatal heart attack on September 26, 1978. According to Mona, a nurse watched, quote, light beams shining in the window and a light which bounced off the walls and ceiling of the hospital at the time of her death. Elaine had told Mona and the staff not to worry. It's just the UFO entities. A couple hours later, she passed away. Up in the upper right, September 14th, 1978, thousands in Sicily, including law enforcement, saw a UFO, quote, as big as an ocean liner. It also appeared in Rome the next 2 evenings. On September 28th, Pope John Paul I died of a heart attack despite a recent clean bill of health. And finally, there in the bottom right, contactee Ted Owens illustrated large-scale psychokinetic effects throughout his life thanks to ongoing contact with space intelligences. Just prior to his death on December 28, 1987, Owens and his neighbor both reported ships and lights above his home. Next slide. Anomalous lights and structured craft, both of those things, are also commonly reported immediately following death. So that was before death. This is after death. A few examples. Kenneth Arnold, famous first UFO witness, said that he saw an orb of light while sitting with his grandmother's body. But more importantly, and specific to the UFO question, he also saw light orbs around airplane crashes while performing search and rescue operations. There's a lot of information out there covering this. In fact, Kenneth Arnold entertained a lot of different ideas about UFOs, but one of the ideas that he entertained was that flying saucers were the connection between the living and the dead. That's from the OG UFO witness, flying saucer witness. Howard Minger, there on the right. His son passed away from a brain tumor at age 12. But Minger's son, before his death, told his father that their contacts from Orion were going to take him after death. Around the time of his son's death, shortly afterwards, a strange light appeared above the dying boy's bed, followed by a bar of light which changed from blue to white, yet failed to illuminate the walls. That's something that we hear in a lot of these anomalous light stories. Howard Minger also claimed that that same night after his son's death, he saw 4 glowing figures on a distant hilltop. The final example is a little bit more recent. July 30th, 1965. Not quite here. Not quite. I'll let you know. Thank you, though. Not quite. We can go back. There we go. July 30th, 1965, over a dozen Chilean witnesses holding a vigil for a child killed in a street accident described a violet light filling the house. Several mourners stepped outside and glimpsed a strange machine mere inches above the street that then flashed and blasted skyward. Now, here we go. Next slide. To reiterate, doubles are an aspect of the soul. Souls are often conceived of as light orbs. Doubles and light orbs are death omens. UFOs appear as light orbs and both precede and follow death in certain examples. Are UFOs souls? If so, UFOs, especially lights, might be wandering souls, freed by the loosening bonds of impending death or freed entirely by the owner's full demise. However, it's important to note that in this scenario, death doesn't have to be involved because finally, next slide, our third option. UFOs are the souls of a third party deliberately separated. If UFOs represent disembodied souls or consciousness, I use those two interchangeably sometimes, then they might represent the wandering soul of someone perfectly healthy who has set their consciousness to wander about. Universally, tradition holds that magically operant individuals, from witches to shamans to astral travelers to saints, they all seem capable of sending their souls abroad in the form of light orbs. We might think of this today as an out-of-body experience or astral travel or even remote viewing if you want to make that argument. In terms of indigenous practice, we see this amongst shamanic communities. Inuit shamans find themselves inhabited by a mysterious light that illuminates secrets both of our realm and the other world, a luminous fire described across North American practice. In fact, among the Muskogee, whenever a medicine man would astrally travel to the spirit world, a ghost light would manifest above his dwelling. So there's some first-hand evidence from that. Contemporarily speaking, there are some meditators who have said the same thing. Metaphysical author Wendy Garrett had her first OBE at age 28. She was meditating, left her physical body behind, but despite no longer having eyes, she could see both her body on the bed and her true form, which she described as a bowling ball-sized yellow sun that flashed and glowed as it levitated in her bedroom. A 2013 paper from the journal Frontiers in Psychology conducted by researchers from Brown University, discovered that among a sample size of 28 Buddhist meditators, 9 subjects, quote, voluntarily reported, so without being asked, they just said, what happened during your meditation? They voluntarily reported lights or other forms of luminous experiences over the course of their practice. Next slide. In other words, UFOs resembling light orbs might be the souls of the dead or the living. You can probably see at this point why I ended up writing 265,000 words. But if they are the souls of the living, they might be astral travelers, they might be remote viewers, but they could be terrestrial or from another planet. This is a way to have your cake and eat it too, right? To me, this is supported to a degree by the idea of something like remote viewing. Could UFOs be remote viewing Earth? And that's what we see when we see these lights in the sky. There's a famous example involving Ingo Swann remote viewing the moon and being noticed that I've always wondered if, what did the people on the moon see? But I won't go too far into the woods, but I kind of wonder if they saw a ball of light. Next slide. Again, this idea has been played with before. A 1962 book by Dr. John Manass entitled Flying Saucers and Spacemen proposed this exact mechanism. And he wrote, "It is a well-known fact to all metaphysicians and occultists that even a clear and strong thought can be projected and be sent many thousands of miles away and be materialized at its place of destination and under proper conditions to be seen by men. All these phenomena are not mysteries or miracles. This is the truth about UFOs, commonly known as flying saucers, spaceships, and spacemen." This actually ended up getting cited by Dr. Jacques Vallée. He was sort of ambivalent on the matter, but he did point out this quote. And he even said, "It would seem, therefore, that earthbound entities or spirits produce images of flying saucers," though, again, he remained very ambivalent. We've seen this idea in a lot of other places, though. It's been entertained by John Keel, Ray Fowler, and Druffel, and most recently, Micah Hanks. The idea that what we are seeing as UFOs are an exteriorized consciousness, perhaps from another civilization. Next slide. To further drive this possibility home, in many indigenous belief systems, especially those from Southern Africa and the Americas, there is little distinction drawn between star people and the vehicles that they pilot. It's an elegant way to depict the soul as vehicle. They're one and the same. No craft, no occupant, just a presence that can change as it sees fit. It gets a little bit confusing because star people is often an interchangeable term for ET among these communities. Star people, ET, ancestors, progenitor races, those terms all start to blur. But one example that I love comes from RD6 Killer Clark, of course. She spoke to an indigenous North Dakotan witness who was speaking with someone that was a star person who dropped to the ground, turned into a ball of light, went into the sky, joined a lot of other balls of light that then joined together to form a gigantic craft that then flew away. So the blurring of the line between occupant and craft and lights, it's all kind of mixed up in some of these cosmologies. Next slide. UFOs as souls make sense when dealing with anomalous lights, but what about structured craft? No belief system describes the soul as a spaceship, right? Next slide. Not a moment, more on that in a moment, but not exactly more on that in a moment, but UFO shapes often speak to a death connection. Remember, example, Jung's idea of totality of the soul. If you look at a lot of these different UFO shapes, you can kind of find similarities. Cross-shaped UFOs are pretty obvious. Brazilian witnesses reported the chupas Dr. Vallée investigated these, and the chupa kind of described as a refrigerator, but it kind of looks like a casket as well. The acorn-shaped object that crashed in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania on December 9th, 1965 also has some significance. In cemetery iconography, acorns symbolize prosperity, fruitfulness, and could represent male sexuality or truth in the power of the spirit that is obtained by two sources, the natural world and the world that waits to be revealed. I've recorded instances of chrysanthemum-shaped UFOs. Chrysanthemums have a similar connotation with longevity, immortality, fullness, completeness. They bloom in the winter, so there's that idea there. It's also the first thing that you see when you enter the DMT realm, right? The chrysanthemum that Terrence Winkin talked about. Horseshoe-shaped UFOs, I've collected some of those. They're also found on tombstones. Hourglass UFOs, I've seen some of those in the literature as well. Is again the passage of time. You'll find that in cemetery iconography. And in 2019, two individuals, Roger Ward and Amy Maloney, saw a big gray anvil in the sky near Elmsdale, Nova Scotia. Anvils in funerary art symbolize the primordial forging of the universe. You can see some examples of that funeral iconography, cemetery iconography. But, next slide. Remember how I discussed Jung was focused on saucers and cigar shapes. This is especially important. Sometimes these cigar shapes spew flame from the rear, like me after eating chili. But this image, not me eating chili, but the cylinder spewing flame from the rear, resembles a torch, which is something you see commonly on Western tombstones and mausoleums. If you imagine a classic rocket shape image, tip pointed skyward, flames below, it becomes a torch upside down. And Douglas Keister, a cemetery iconography expert, wrote, "The inverted torch, the rocket ship image, is a purely funerary symbol. It is unlikely that it will be found anywhere but the cemetery," or if we might add, UFO sightings. In funeral iconography, an inverted torch suggests, in his words, that the soul or fire continues to exist in the next realm, while a flameless inverted torch simply means life being extinguished. However, cigars are also obvious fertility symbols. Won't go into it too much, but you can't talk about death without sex. They're two sides of the same coin. Cigar shapes are phallic. Egg-shaped UFOs kind of speak for themselves. Here's a fun example that combines UFOs, fertility, and death. Next slide. Yeah, this is a thing. This is from Cynthia Hines' UFO Afro News. Printed without any sense of irony. Around midnight between April 14th and 15th, 1987, farmers attending a dead colleague's wake in Zimbabwe saw this picture, silently dart across the sky. As much as we like to laugh at that, the appearance at a wake, I think, specifically blatantly encodes this cycle of death and conception. Next slide. UFOs also mirror halo shapes. You can go through all the literature. That's a big part of what I talk about at the end of the Ecology of Souls. Cephalophores, the idea of someone having their head cut off where you put the halo, that's something that I think is really critical to the conclusion of ecology, but we're not going to go into it today. That's the compelling thing to make you interested in the project. Next slide. One of the things that I find most interesting is this idea that UFOs are psychopomp boats, reimagined for the modern age. You might remember that we talked about the psychopomps earlier, these folk figures, these religious figures, these animals and natural phenomena that escort us to the other side. Psychopomp boats are a very prominent symbol in these traditions, because again, it's that idea of travel. Any travel symbol can be a psychopomp symbol, but boats are very special. They're worth quite a lot of mention. But to set this up, let me explain the conflation between the stars and the afterlife. To begin with, the sky and stars were always conceived as one possible location of the other world or afterlife. Our Judeo-Christian concept of heaven above, hell below drew upon a variety of other older influences. Hell was below because a lot of pagan underworlds were below. The dead are buried underground. Hills harbored the dead and therefore fairies in pagan thought. And of course, we all know that mountains and mesas contain alien bases, right? These ideas are related. Dead underground, dead in the hills, dead all these different things. Heaven was often the realm of the gods more often than not. Some select revered dead and heroes went there in various cosmologies, including the Greco-Romans, where they might become stars. They literally became a ball of light in the sky. In some belief, eventually all the dead went to the sky and their deaths became stars. Sometimes there was this idea in folklore that when you were born, a star would appear, but there was always this connection between souls and stars. To further confuse things, though, sometimes the dead reach the underworld in certain cosmologies by counterintuitively ascending to go to the underworld. The Milky Way for a lot of New World tribes was considered the path of souls. The work of Greg Little does a great job explaining this. How that a lot of indigenous mound builder sites were aligned to Orion and at certain parts in the calendar that would allow for the ascension of the soul. We see vague allusions to this sort of idea of like a portal or an OG in some of these indigenous traditions in the center of the universe as being the place where souls go to. But the most important thing, especially if you look at like Egyptian and Grecian beliefs, is the idea that the underworld was placed in the sky because it was the part of the sky that was below the ecliptic, right? So it was below the path of the sun. That was the underworld. So you get a lot of these references to the underworld being in the sky because that's just what it was viewed as. A stellar underworld, if you want to think of it that way. A good example would be from, I believe it's the pyramid text describing the Egyptian dead taking a night boat through the sky to the underworld. So that sounds counterintuitive to us, but sky is also underworld. Next slide. This idea of the sky as overworld, as I would call it, not underworld, but overworld, only gained in strength as our mysteries dwindled. As we mapped the entire planet, any idea that the other world or other worlds might be on Earth were undermined. No longer could the other world or the afterlife be beneath our feet or beyond a mountain range or lay in some far undiscovered country to the west or sit on a distant island at the end of the horizon. We mapped all this stuff. So in other words, the other world was permanently transposed to the stars after the world was mapped. Islands in the sea became planets in the void, but the meaning of reaching the other world still remained a vessel, the UFO. Next slide. Many psychopomp symbols include these themes of transportation, as I mentioned. You've got the birds, you've got the horses. Horses in the sun have a strong connotation in Indo-European belief. Again, there's psychopomp symbols there too, the sun being a psychopomp symbol. But above all, and this is, again, you can't say it's universal, but dang if it's not close. Boats and ships were psychopomp symbols. They were the best way for ancient mankind to traverse significant distances and even allowed access to otherwise unreachable territories. Because of this, boats became a potent death symbol. Tolkien understood this. Look at the end of Lord of the Rings. The ring bearer goes to the west across the sea to the Undying Lands. And you're like, is Frodo dying? I think he's dying. That's what's encoded in that. Ship burials were a staple of Norse internment, both actual ships and rings of stones arranged like ships. So you actually see the Oseberg ship burial. That's an actual ship as grave good, but also these ship burials over here in terms of stone effigies. We don't really get a lot of these Viking burials at sea where you shoot the flaming arrow. There are some times when the bodies would be pushed out to sea, but the actual like lighting the boat on fire didn't happen all that often. But we also see, the Khufu ship in Egypt, another grave good. The idea of this ship carrying you to another place. Ship coffins are especially common in Asia. Some of our earliest examples of commons are reappropriated canoes, like these Chinese boat coffins seen in the Wuyi Mountains. You also see this in islands Southeast Asia. So it's just, we just see it all the time. Like our earliest coffins were boats. Like it doesn't get more explicit than that. So from an archetypal standpoint, coffins and boats are really interchangeable. Next slide. It makes sense to me that since boats are one of the most pertinent psychopomp motifs, remember Charon, the ferryman? Odin was sometimes a ferryman. Barnum Beer would carry the Australian dead across the waters in her canoe. It makes sense that it should show up still because it's such a deeply embedded archetype. Boats are a common feature of NDEs. In June 2006, there was an individual who was taken to a tropical location and they saw a giant vessel below them. A more dramatic example is in 2011, there was another individual who had internal bleeding. He found himself standing beside a man and a boat, both composed of fluorescent white glass in his near-death experience. The boat began moving down a narrow, metallic, glassy, and white tunnel before lurching to a halt. I've kind of got that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory kind of thing in my head, but this metallic boat that's carrying him to the afterlife lurches to a halt, and the near-death experiencer turns around, sees another figure that looks more authoritative than the first, and silently and easily plucks him out of the tunnel and back into life. So we still get the symbol. We still get the psychopomp symbol of the boat appearing in modern paranormal experiences. Next slide. I would argue, is the UFO a reinvented psychopomp boat? It's the same idea, right? And this is not my idea. Carl Jung wrote, the idea that the UFO might be a sort of Karen. It's certainly one that I have not met in the literature so far. And I'm going to brag a little bit, and I'll say until 2022, when I decided to do this. To this end, I'd like to close. We're still got a little bit to go, but this is sort of the home stretch. I'd like to close with the possibility that UFOs are actual, sometimes physical, structured craft from the beyond. So you've got your lights in the sky. They might be souls. They might be psychopaths. But there's an argument to be made that there's something physical going on here. We're getting really weird. It's that old Star Trek V thing, right? What does God need with a starship? But as bizarre as it is, the idea of UFOs being a reinvented psychopomp boat really fits nicely with them being seen immediately before and after death. There are some precedents in Neoplatonism that also speak to this idea. But what evidence is for that? Well, first of all, I would say that, ufology is a transportation obsessed discipline. How did they get here? Where are they going? Where are they taking? These are all the questions that ufologists want to know. And so it makes sense that as a transportation themed discipline, as much as ufology is disciplined, that it makes sense that we would just sort of reinvent and reappropriate that and apply these older beliefs onto that, or it's all been the same thing all along. I don't know. But again, it's one thing to speculate. It's one thing to say this is archetypally consistent. What evidence do we have for that? Next slide. Book by John E. Best called Link and Communique. It provided evidential communications from the dead. He spoke with his deceased fiancée, who was a nurse named Marjorie. Her occupation as a nurse extended into the afterlife, where she was charged with visiting various hospitals. To do this, she was granted by superior forces access to a special vehicle, which reads a lot like a flying saucer. It allowed her to travel thousands of miles an hour, both on and off planet. Another interesting bit of evidence. Next slide. The artwork of Pablo Amaringo, the late ayahuasca artist and shaman. Some of the best art depicting ayahuasca visions. He and Graham Hancock developed a relationship. But his art, especially you'll see in the one in the bottom left, that painting, include objects that look a lot like UFOs. And before Amaringo died, he told Graham Hancock that the flying saucers in his visions were not mere spacecraft, but rather vehicles for entering and leaving the spirit world. Pablo Amaringo elaborated elsewhere that these vehicles may take many shapes, are able to attain infinite speed, and can travel underwater or under the earth. The beings traveling in them are like spirits, having bodies more subtle than ours, appearing and disappearing at will. Next slide. So if these are physical at all, right? Who's building these? Maybe we are. Next slide. Here's starting to get trippier. A lot of cultures describe the afterlife as a mirror image of our world. The ancient Chinese thought that it was an example of the empire plowed under, was the phrase that they would use. In Egypt, the Tuat, their afterlife, was a mirror image of what you would expect to see on the surface. You've got dams, you've got farms, you've got a need to worship, a need to work, a need to eat, a need to sleep. These things just kept on continuing. You probably are familiar with the Native American happy hunting ground trope, as overused as that is. That was the idea. That was like an idealized version of this existence. But there was this idea that comes with that this afterlife contains within it the same capacity for advancement, for technological advancement, for fads to change over time. This was exemplified in an account that I found from a Jeju Island shaman in Korea who was speaking with an ethnologist, and someone had offered white clothing to one of the ancestors in their shrine. And the shaman said, don't give them that. These days, the ancestors don't wear such clothing. Now they wear pretty things. The ancestors have become refined. The idea that the ancestors would change their minds over time is so foreign to us, but it's something, the idea that the afterlife continues to develop and continues to change. Several examples in Ecology of Souls, my book, describe the dead after being met with during UFO contact, alluding to continuing their tasks and chores. I have an example that I collected from Russia of someone being taken to an alien planet and seeing a dead neighbor who's like got a bunch of lumber over his arm and he's going off to build something. I think those are the broad strokes of it. So we do see references to this. But if you look at this from another way, like some UFO researchers talk about breakaway civilizations, this is kind of an interpretation of a breakaway civilization. It's also kind of an interpretation of an alternate dimension, right? Next slide. Whitley Strieber has also sort of obliquely talked about this as well. His current interpretation of his implant is that it represents not extraterrestrial technology, or maybe even not even technology from the visitors, but an afterlife communications device designed posthumously by EVP pioneer Konstantin Raudove. Electronic voice phenomenon, the idea that you get voices that you didn't hear on recordings after playback, a very common ghost hunting technique. Raudove was very much involved in this. And there's some really chilling recordings that you can find online of him calling Sarah Estep, one of his colleagues, and leaving a message on her voicemail saying, hey, it's me. Well, it's more like, hey, Sarah, I am back from the dead. We have done great work. It's like that. But seriously, look up Konstantin Raudove death recordings or EVP recordings. It's pretty interesting. But again, I reiterate, an afterlife communications device designed posthumously by deceased EVP pioneer Konstantin Raudove put into Whitley. It strongly implies that we are seeing some type of relationship or technology exchange between our dead and what we conceive of as aliens. But there's nothing new under the sun because, next slide, it's actually a really old idea. This is a summary of a May 3rd, 1969 lecture delivered by Sir Victor Goddard. This is Charles Bowen summarizing what Goddard said. He went on to suggest that UFOs may well be the work of departed ones and that the consciousnesses of the dead can return to display, for example, the wonders of the new world, very Struberian phrase there, new world in which they find themselves. To take the idea even farther, could not the consciousnesses of those who had been technically skilled in this present world of ours return to demonstrate, for example, the advanced aerial machines of their new world? The same idea. To wrap this up, I love this story. Next slide. To wrap this up and drive home this point, consider the tale of Clifford Muchena, a witness from the Mozambique-Zimbabwe border, whose interpretation of his UFO encounter strongly reflects the sentiments of the afterlife changing and adapting, but also being involved with UFOs. On August 15th, 1981, Clifford Muchena saw what he described as a ball of blinding light rolling through town, entering buildings. He and others believed that it was a fire, and so they rang the village's emergency bell, which you can see, I believe, I think I included it. Yeah, I think it's maybe in the bottom right is the bell. Yeah, that's the bell. These are all black and white photos that we're dealing with here. But as he did that, Clifford falls to the ground, and as he does, he sees three strange men nearby, and they're all wearing these identical silvery, shiny overalls. And Cynthia Hind is interviewing him, and she says, "Oh, it sounds like the UFO thing. It sounds like they're spacemen." And Clifford was just confused. And he was like, do you mean astronauts? He said, I read about astronauts in a book. Look, some 20 or so people in my village saw this thing. They think it was ghosts. They think it might have been the spirits of my ancestors. And Cynthia Hind responds with, well, with all due respect, I don't think your ancestors would have worn silvery overalls. They'd probably be wearing something different. And Clifford Muchena told her, yes, but times change. And I just love how charming that insight is. So thank you all for following me on this journey. I know it's probably been a lot to take in. There is a clearer way to present this than what I've done. But yeah, you can find it all in Ecology of Souls. I outline all this and with more supporting evidence than I can muster for this. But thank you for having me here. And it's been a real pleasure. Good way to spend a Saturday afternoon.
Well, thank you, Josh. This is the kind of work that one really has to sit with to contemplate, and there's just so many ideas to explore. The cover for the third volume with the three people. To me, this is probably not what I'm not sure this is supposed to represent that, but they look like people in military fatigues. And there's this one tale that's been making the rounds of a military guy describing when they were looking for a lost.
I think I saw this. Yeah, I saw
looking for a lost crashed plane to recover the Americans' bodies, and as they recover the bodies, they see up on the ridge these balls of light that equal the number of bodies, and then they depart.
It's the same that Arnold saw, it's the exact same idea.
Yeah, like you were saying, his of course in his original sighting, he was looking for a downed aircraft, and that was something he did on a regular basis. But and this is something I try to drive home to people all the time is this idea of um, uh, the as you say, the spirits of spiritual consciousness of humans has long been associated with balls of light, and that is, as you say, also a recurring theme in all these different areas of human experience that are so important to us.
Well, I think it's really interesting that, like, when do we see the balls of light? Well, we tend to see them at night, wherever it's night where we are. Well, what are people doing at night? They're sleeping. And when does the soul wander? During trance states or near illness or when you're asleep. I mean, there's such a, I don't like, I consider Greg Bishop a mentor, right? So the idea of getting high on my own supply in this domain is something I try to avoid, but I cannot get away from the parsimony that is in this. There's something to it that I wish, and as with all my other stuff, like, please, someone else take on this idea, cite me and give me credit, right? But take this idea and carry it further, like, because I think that this is a hypothesis that should stand alongside ultra terrestrials and crypto terrestrials and extraterrestrials. There's something here that's worth considering seriously.
I agree completely, and the bit about technological advance and this other afterlife or whatever realm, this, like with the airships, part of the UFO historical epoch, that was just beyond our level at this on this reality.
Yeah.
But maybe they were already making advances over there. Just fascinating. And there's just so much more to explore in the book, and I like you allude to the whole bit about the headless aspect, and you conclude the book with that, and it's just like, oh, and it's not just an, oh, by the way, it's, oh, by the way, here's a whole other rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, and I didn't even touch on time. Like, time has something to do with this, and that's, you talk about another rabbit hole to go down. I had the good fortune of speaking with Dr. Michael Masters at an event in New York last December, and if you look at it like if you look at it like close up, it seems like we're diametrically opposed in what we're saying. I'm saying it's dead people, and he's saying that it's people from the future. But if you dial out and like take time not as seriously, which I don't think we should, because Eric Wargo's work and all this stuff,
right?
It starts to look like the same thing. Like we're driving at the same thing.
Right? This, and in so many ways, this is so diametrically opposed to the prevailing disclosure obsessed, technological threat obsessed era that we've entered into post 2017. But as we were talking previously, there is this now finally this momentum growing with academia, and I think that's where I think there's probably a lot of folks that can really sink their teeth into this and explore it even more potently, not to just keep exploring. We do have at least one question here from everything you have researched. Is it better to go toward the light after death or avoid it? Is the white light a trick, a trap, or something else?
I get asked this a lot. And it's a part that I didn't quite go into this. But there are some accounts from psychics and mediums who say that the light is indeed a trick. My sort of discussion of the lights, mostly in book 2, at least, where it focuses on the UFO question, was the idea that if you didn't go into the light, you would sort of fall off and wind up being captured by the Greys. That's the late work of late Nigel Kerner, I believe. I will say this. There's something unsettling about the way that not only Abrahamic cultures, but Western society has diminished the role of the psychopath. By which I mean the idea that we can just sort of trot off into the evanescence and be happy go lucky without any guides, without any preparation, without any wisdom of what to do is kind of unprecedented. There were books about the art of dying. Look at the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It gives you detailed instructions on how to get to the other side.
Yeah, how to not get lost on the way.
Yeah, and so like today we just like if among those who take the idea of the afterlife seriously, we tend to view it as like this automatic thing. And you don't find that in just about any indigenous culture either. There are demons, there are ravenous dogs, there are giant snakes, there are rivers that you have to cross, the river being a very common death symbol. All these different sort of barriers, and it's almost like it turns into a D&D quest, right? Like you've got to know the right answers to all the riddles to get to the other side. So I do think that our only advice in the 21st century is go towards the light. Like that kind of does ring a bit hollow for me,
Yeah. Well, I know also in your presentation you did credit all the
yes, yeah,
art contributors and of course just
thank you. I always want to do that.
Yeah. Well, Josh, I just am so glad that you're with us and exploring these strange realms. I want folks to buy your books. Go to joshuacutchin.com. Follow what you're doing. I know you're working hard on your next project, and very excited to see where that leads. And I just want to thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to speaking to you more in the future.
It's an absolute pleasure, Smile. Thanks so much. I really do appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. It's always kind of funny because I try to, again, keeping with the idea of getting high on your own supply, I never want to write the same thesis twice. So like I'm in a completely different direction. And now I don't care about what I'm working on now. I want to go back to the stuff about the dead. So I'm a little bit irritated about that, but no, it was a nice break from what I'm doing right now to sort of go back into to slip back into the warm bath that is Ecology of Souls.
Well,
so I really appreciate it.
And you're branching off into fiction as well. So
yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
All right. Well, stick around for a minute, and I'll talk to you after we end here. And thank you, everybody. And we'll look forward to next month's presentation. And we'll have details about that at the Patreon and anomalyarchives.org. Good night. Boy, it's not nighttime. What?